something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. Today, I am joined by Charles Derber and Yale Magrass, authors of the new book, Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. Charles Derber is professor of sociology at Boston College. He has written 26 books on politics, democracy, fascism, corporations, capitalism, climate change, war, the culture wars, and social change. Yale Magrass is a Chancellor Professor of Sociology at University of Massachusetts-Dartmouth. He is the author / co-author of 9 books and 80 articles. His work explores how militaristic capitalism distorts everyday life as it promotes inequality, bullying, environmental devastation, and war. We are unlocking this episode for everyone. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. We are only able to do this because of our paying subscribers. The tech monopoly platforms will never be our friends. If you appreciate deep political analysis and forensic historiography, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. We just kicked off our new Gray Alliance series. The Gray Alliance is Peter Dale Scott's term for the extremely important institutionalized relationship between the U.S. national security state and organized crime. We trace the evolution and consolidation of American organized crime and the essential roles it has played for the U.S. empire and the oligarchs who own it. We'll be looking at the Lansky Syndicate, Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters, Jack Ruby, the CIA's global drug connection, the CIA's role in the JFK assassination and in Watergate, and the Gray Alliance elements which link all these things together. You cannot find this material anywhere else, so if these subjects interest you and you want to understand how the Gray Alliance played a crucial role in making the U.S. into the corrupt, lawless, dying empire that we see today, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Yale Magrass, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And Charles Derber, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, Aaron.
The two of you are the owners. I'm looking at the cover. You're the authors of the new book, Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. And either one of you could take this question, but what made you decide to wade into this area, this deep state, taboo, sort of strange subject? It's, on the one hand, it's taboo, and on the other hand, you hear more people just admitting or using it, saying, well, the deep state may do this or that, because we all know that the president can't really be in charge when he's barely able to get up and down the stairs without falling down and such. So what made you decide to write about the deep state?
Well, let me just say we're recording this and talking 2 days after the most, catastrophic, in my view, the most catastrophic election probably maybe in the history of the country. I mean, it's just really an overwhelming moment. I spent time in a class yesterday, which was kind of a wake. The students could not talk. Several students were unable to speak and were crying. And, it's just, I want to mark this because this is not an ordinary period, and I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by the consequences of the election. We anticipated the possibility of this, and the book does address the history of authoritarian and fascist politics in the United States. So I'm not unhappy to be talking about this. I think the country is going to need a lot of conversations like this. But I do want to just note, and Aaron, I'll trust you to guide us in this. I think people are going to be very, very focused on what this election means, processing the feelings they're having as they're looking at what's happening, what happened during the election, and how to deal with it. Our book is an effort to offer a historical perspective that I think will be helpful to people who really are deeply distressed about the effects of the election, worry about the future of any kind of democracy in the United States. And the book was written because we think that almost from the beginning of the country, there has been a profound kind of set of structural and cultural, economic sort of hurdles to any kind of true, meaningful democracy. And the idea of the deep state, of course, is an idea that Americans know from Trump, is an idea really about the idea that power really arises from sources outside of ordinary people and away from the kind of sort of things you think about during elections and political parties, that there are forces that are built into the country related to economic class and money on the one hand, and to caste or race and gender on the other. And those played out in this election, but it's playing out now in a very, very, very profound way. And I think we can't fully anticipate what we're going to see now.
Charlie and I somewhat differ on this. Don't get me wrong, I am horrified by the thought of a Trump return. But I am not convinced it's unique. I am not convinced that Trump is all that different from Bush Jr., and Cheney is the same regime as Bush Jr., Reagan, and Nixon. And you go, of course, up further back. I am expecting truly horrible things out of Trump, but we saw this before. And Harris allied with the Cheneys, which I think was a huge mistake, and substantially delegitimated her, even though I voted for her. Cheney, of course, invaded Iraq, invaded Afghanistan, and gave us the Patriot Act, which is essentially a fascist constitution. It was not enforced. Now there's a very good chance that Trump will enforce it in the way that Cheney, when he was in power, did not. And of course, there's Reagan. And we constantly hear these comparisons and talk of a new Republican Party and saying that Reagan would never do what Trump did. Now, there are differences. If anything, Reagan's foreign policy was actually more aggressive than Trump's. And we hear people praising Reagan, saying he stood up for America, he secured American interest more than Trump did. So they're actually praising Trump for being more militaristic and more of a threat to world peace. And of course, we know what Nixon did. We don't have to talk about, yes, we do have to talk about Vietnam, Cambodia, the bombings, the attack on the peace movement, the infiltration of the left. And I wonder just how different Trump is. Not that I want Trump in any way. Not that I'm not horrified the fact that Harris was defeated. But I think there may be exaggeration when we say this is essentially new and this is a greater threat than anything we've ever seen in known history.
So one of the ways that this book might be interesting to readers is that Yale and I have written a number of books together, but we have strong differences. And as people may have just heard, my view is that, the book is, in fact, a historical documentation of the nature of American authoritarianism and how much it's shaped the nature of American democracy. So I think that Yale is right that we have a long history, both in terms of domestic and foreign policy, that is fundamentally authoritarian, violent, and working against the interests of ordinary Americans as well, of course, people all over the world. Where I disagree with Yale is that I think the domestic consequences of this election are different. I can tell you that because I'm teaching at a university. The environment of teaching here, when during, for example, the Vietnam War, I was organizing in my campus a national student strike when I was a faculty member at Brandeis. And I was able to carry out that kind of thing. Now, it's inconceivable on American campuses to do that as a professor. And that's before Trump. There's already been a level of repression inside the university that in my career, which is scarily long at this point, spans decades, I feel like the university has become a very different environment across the country. And I see it in the culture of the students, the kind of political control that's being operated on curriculum, on speech, and it's frightening. And I think it's just a small part of the kind of massive kind of repression. I mean, the book argues that the democracy has always had a veneer, which has been very important to the survival of the economic system and the political elites of the country. The veneer has always offered a meaningful form of speech, free speech, and protest and so forth, which has given Americans the impression, correctly, that this is not an entirely fascist or authoritarian state, that there's always been room.
So you mean that the regime in the United States has
Yes.
always had a democratic veneer? Is that
Correct.
what you mean? Yes.
That is exactly what I mean. That all the way from the very beginning, there has been a veneer, and the word veneer suggests a complete illusion. It's not completely illusory. I mean, the rights to speak and to vote and the kinds of stuff that Yale and I have done through our entire career is meaningful because it has allowed us to participate and bring to generations of students ideas that would have been shut down if the veneer had not existed. On the other hand, the veneer has given a cloak of legitimacy to the entire system that has allowed and enabled both big money, corporate capitalist forces, which have huge, imperial interests in the world and repressive interests at home against American working people, and which played out in the election here, along with caste forces, which began at the very beginning of the country. Aaron, in the beginning of the book, we argue that the American Revolution was the coming together of two very different sort of nascent or emerging deep states. Deep state meaning a group of unelected forces.
Like oligarchy.
Any kind of...
Talking about elites of wealth and power.
Yes.
That worked together.
Well, we describe two kinds of deep states. And what you just described, a class-based or economically based, financial, money-based corporate elite, which is kind of structurally built into the game of capitalism. It always exists in capitalism. And in the South, at the beginning of the country, you had a caste system which interacted with class in a pretty cooperative way based on race and slavery. And the whole American Revolution was written around Jefferson's language, flowery language around the Independence, Declaration of Independence and the Revolution. In fact, it was kind of a Magna Carta revolution. They were very influenced by British history and British thought. And Magna Carta is a 1215 in the Middle Ages when a bunch of white nobility rebelled against the monarch and said, we don't want the monarch to have total control. That's precisely what the American Revolution did, in my judgment. It was a Magna Carta of the American side. It's a sort of declared democracy, but what was meant by democracy was that rich white men, who happened to be called Jefferson and Washington and Adams, would be able to rule the country. And there wouldn't be a king, King George, or the symbol of British crown and parliament, that would control them. They would, before the revolution, they had a lot of control in America. After the revolution, the same people controlled most of the country. And you were able to form a government in the name of a revolutionary independence, which was really a Magna Carta statement that a small elite of wealthy white men would rule the country. And in his later correspondence before he died, Jefferson frequently was asked and opined on the question of whether Black people and women would be able to participate in this order, whether this would become a much more. Jefferson never felt that was possible. He felt that African American slavery might end, but Africans would have to go back to Africa. And the founders never really imagined or believed that the country could be run by anything other than a Magna Carta type principle. In other words, a kind of nobility of white males who would basically dominate the country. And in fact, as we sort of spell out in the history that we flesh out, despite all the veneer of democracy that gave Americans the impression that Jefferson's words were meaningful and meant that the government was serving ordinary working people, we show the ways in which, while the veneer is important, that the government has largely operated in the service of large, fortunes, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, and so forth. Now, where Yale and I differ is that Yale thinks that the veneer is somehow going to be likely maintained under Trump, I guess. Whereas my feeling is the veneer is already begun to be ripped. And
Trump has gained legitimacy by this time winning the popular vote.
Yes.
And clear-cut victory in Electoral College. Now, we want to talk about the American Revolution. It was not a revolution at all. As Charlie just pointed out, if you name the most powerful people in America before the Revolution, you'll get names like Franklin, Jefferson, Washington. Name those powerful people afterwards? Funny names. Franklin, Jefferson, Washington. The exact same people. Nothing changed. What was changed was they were now going to rule without accountability to, they said, lying, the British Crown, but really British Parliament. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson keeps saying the king did X, Y, and Z. Jefferson knew that's not true. Jefferson knew everything he said the king did was really done by Parliament. And in fact,
Benjamin Franklin said those things explicitly, though. He said, like, all of these acts of Parliament were yada, yada, yada. So it was like, it's sort of like what the U.S. does when they turn the head of state into the boogeyman in Iran or wherever. It was like, but of course, it's a bigger thing. Parliament they were screwing the U.S. and there were creditors. Like the U.S. was, it was a revolution against, in a sense that it like the colonies were hopelessly in debt when you look at the balance of trade and such, and so they were being screwed over by the British, even the common people and the elites too.
Absolutely.
In a sense. So
yeah. But just come back to a minute to what we were talking about the veneer, which is an important idea in the way we think about the world.
Yeah, this is a key thing, and I agree that this question of how much substance there is, because we can at least talk about it, which is not nothing, but how much significance do we assign?
So I think the election now, and this is where Yale and I disagree, I guess, about in terms of what's going to happen next, and when after January 20th. Like I say, I think the veneer has already been ripped to some degree. I see it on college campuses. You see it generally in the kind of the cultural conservatism that's sort of keeping the level of political democratic activism, very muted on campuses, on communities. Labor has, in the summer of, last year, has had a revival, but labor leaders like Sean Fain, who I have a lot of admiration for, have had enormous trouble sort of mobilizing their base of their own union members not to vote for Trump. Many of them did end up voting for Trump. And this is part of we can talk about why that's so, but my concern right now, 2 days after this election, is that this veneer, why I say it's a historic election, different from Reagan and so forth, is that the veneer is, I think, going to be ripped in a much more substantial way. I believe that the ability to go out and, for me personally, it's just, what can I say in the classroom now that will be tolerated? If I say, if women were to once again protest right after Trump is inaugurated, would they be allowed to march? Would they be shot? We know from the first term that Trump wanted to shoot protesters several times during his first term, and his military intervened and said that they prevented him. They stopped him, said they would not bring the military in. This time, the vetting of military people and the Justice Department, particularly the lawyers in the Justice Department, the Federalist Society, and the whole Project 2025, what they vetted about, I hear that somewhere between 25 and 50,000 people that can be put into these Schedule F departments. I worry particularly about the military and the Justice Department, which I think will be, mobilized from day one, very unlike the first term of Trump, to rip the veneer in a much more significant way. I mean, there'll still be voting. In Russia, you can vote today. There'll still be parties. There are different parties in Russia today. The thing about authoritarian rule is that it operates in ways very often that large parts of the population don't notice as particularly significant. When Hitler came in, there were many people, both Jewish and non-Jewish in Germany, who felt that this guy was a blowhard, Mr. Hitler, and that the aristocracy and so forth would rein him in. I think a lot of the corporate people in America today who did not mobilize against Trump, most of them were quiet and stayed sort of wanting to please him. We know what Jeff Bezos did at the Washington Post. He prevented an overt endorsement of Harris. I think the corporate elite now is probably sort of trying to calculate what their prospects are in this. And that's going to be interesting. I think we've got an oligarchy of people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and many of these Silicon Valley oligarchs who are pretty much out there. Not all of Silicon Valley by any means, but a significant fraction of the Silicon Valley people who are trying to basically accommodate Trump. And sort of, I think you're going to have, people understand Russian absolutism, authoritarianism, and oligarchy. And I think that Trump would like to create a kind of oligarchic system like that, a bunch of billionaires that he's very close to, that he socializes with in Mar-a-Lago, and who will be operative. The person who has been tapped to organize the entire budgetary structure of the American government is the richest man in the world. It's Elon Musk. Musk is going to have, is going to put out a white paper on how to organize the budget. We're talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public education, environmental regulation. There's a whole bunch of absolutely vital issues. And I want to just highlight climate change, because I think climate change is going to be one of the first. Remember, Trump said on day one, the first thing I'm going to do is drill, baby, drill, open up public lands, massive amounts of public lands to mining companies, drilling companies, oil companies, and so forth. I think the climate impact of this is really going to be one of the most fateful things.
And Yale, you disagree, and I'll offer a prediction or a kind of formulation here too about this issue. But you don't think that he can really? You think he's less likely to attempt to full on establish, more clearly fascist sort of institutions? You think that he will be restrained in some ways for this, and that he's a little bit more similar to the past than it would seem, except for like the branding?
I do believe that Trump has a very long precedent. And I do believe that even the reduction in civil liberties that Charlie just talked about on campuses has been going on for a very long time. It is a gradual process. It started long before Trump was a political figure. It can be traced at least to the Reaganist reaction against the New Left, and Reaganism was essentially an effort to question the New Left. I see Trump as a danger. I see Trump as somebody we have every reason to be afraid of, but I don't believe he is unprecedented. And yes, we are going to see real authoritarianism. And yes, we are going to see real attacks on civil liberties. We're going to see attacks on unions. We're going to see, erosion of the standard of living of ordinary people. I do not predict anything good coming out of a Trump regime, but I am not convinced this is as unprecedented as Charlie, and much of the media will allow us to believe fascism is essentially a reaction to a crisis.
Yeah.
And of course, we can talk about the crisis within Europe in post-World War I, and of course, the Great Depression. To be sure, America is facing a long-term decline. It maintains the world's largest military. That has not changed. Its economic dominance, as you pointed out, has clearly eroded. It is still the world's largest economy, with 20% of world GDP. But once upon a time, it had 50% of world GDP. So
Yeah.
it's really...
And also today, a lot of this is totally predatory, rent-seeking, where these basically monopoly interests and so on just collect money from people, like paying off
Sure.
ridiculous debts and such, all contributes to GDP, but it's really not economic prosperity in a measurable form.
Yeah. And people voted for Trump. We're hearing America has the strongest economy in the world, but they face inflation, they face an eroding standard of living, and they very good question to ask. If there is this prosperity, well, why am I not seeing it? It's certainly, I'm not experiencing that prosperity. So they are legitimately very distrustful of the economic promoters who tell them things are good, things are bad for me. So maybe Trump can fix it. Now, as it happens, when Trump was in power, the relative growth, a gap between the very, very rich and everyone else grew. There were these tax cuts, which was his sole economic achievement, which overwhelmingly acute to the very rich. Granted, there was somewhat less inflation, but the inflation really began when Trump was in power. So there's no reason whatsoever anybody to believe that Trump is going to fix real problems. But does that mean people are not really suffering? And of course, people keep hearing about, as Charlie said, race and gender, which means if you are male, which means you are white, and you're barely getting by, you have a very good question. What is in this for me? So you have very good reasons to not trust. And Trump is telling you, I am on your side, even though he's done absolutely nothing whatsoever to help you. So they have very little reason to support Biden, Kamala, and the Democrats. And there is an alternative, for better or worse. So the action may be, let's try it.
The way I think about this, Aaron, is that if you think of capitalism as a house, the country as a house, we're living in a period like in the first Gilded Age, or second Gilded Age, which really began in the Reagan era, of really astronomically growing inequality, levels of inequality. They're quite unprecedented. What that means, sort of, if you visualize the house, you have the people sort of in the deep state, the unelected people and their political allies living on the condominium elites in the top floor, living luxuriously. Everybody else is living on the basement or the bottom floor, and sees stairwells, which tell them if they work hard, they will be able to climb up and perhaps join the people living on the top. But the stairwells as Yale has suggested, have been narrowing as the empire has been declining over a long period of decades. So there's a kind of structural crisis in the house. There's always, as inequality grows, and as the conditions of living on the top, if you're Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, living on the very top floor with billionaire incomes, and most people are living on the ground floor, sort of about to drop into the basement. the real obvious, there's a structural crisis that continues to grow in the nature of the regime. This house is a corporate regime, and it's going to explode at some point if the people on the bottom are constantly looking up, aware. They see the stairwells are getting narrower. They're not moving. If anything, they're more fearful of falling to the basement. And how do the people on the top manage this? Well, as long as it appears as if the inequality levels are relatively constrained and that the stairwells are large enough, people can believe that they can all make it up. There's a system for everybody having some sort of democratic opportunity to move up and do better in life. But in recent years, certainly since Reagan, since the end of the New Deal, since the 70s, the crisis of this regime has gotten far more intense. What that does is it produces the fallback in crises that leads toward authoritarianism and has been always, sort of present in the United States, which is the strategy of the elites living on the top floor. This is in this upstairs, downstairs house, is to make sure that all the masses on the downstairs are not able to unify against people on the top. Now, there's one really, really effective way to make sure that people who are working hard and struggling can't afford even their little, nooks in the bottom floor and are getting really scared and really angry. The way to make sure that they do not unify against the upstairs people is to divide them. How do you divide them? The clearest historical model that has always been effective is to rely on caste. Remember, this is a class-based house. The people at the top are a kind of ruling class, ruling over most of the people in the working classes and the unemployed below. But it's also a caste house. It's a house where the people living on the bottom are divided by race and gender and ethnicity and religion. And the people on the elite, top of the house are fully aware of that, what that presents to them. It presents their best opportunity for dividing the people who live on the bottom from unifying in some sort of struggle to overthrow the upstairs, downstairs architecture of the house. There are two ways you can do that. One is to point out there are other houses in the neighborhood which are dangerous. They could be called Russia or Iraq or Iran or whatever. And so you can turn people, say, you people on the bottoms need to unite with us because we're going to operate together to fight the enemy in the other houses abroad. And that leads to the rationale for imperialism, militarism, and global hegemony, which is essential to the financial interests of people on the house in any case. This is the enemy abroad provides the framework for ensuring that the masses of public become afraid and say, yeah, we do need this kind of global militarism, which has characterized America as a global hegemon since the end of World War II, but was building long before that.
It was the same for the British. I mean, the inventors of capitalism. It's
right.
like the enclosure movement. It's the enclosure movement that creates these, this surplus population, and then they look, hey, why don't we just go and resume our domination of Ireland? So they send Sir Walter Raleigh's brother, that guy over there that just chopped off everyone's head. I can't remember his name now, or Humphrey Gilbert, that was his name. Mm-hmm. And then they just said, well, even further west, we can go even more. But it was really, you can read policy planning documents from the English saying, like, we can deal with the problems of the land shortage, but the land shortage is because of the textile industry and such. And it's just like, that's capitalism. Right away, you have to have imperialism in the frontier. Yes. For a long time, the U.S., it was really the frontier that was
That's right. It was a frontier, and the
United States inherited the British Empire. What the world wars really did was shift the capitals of the empire. The economic capital moved from London to New York. The political capital moved from London to Washington. But it's essentially the same empire, and the British are now
bigger. They consolidated all the empires. They consolidated all the white into this white power league and made a transition from colonialism to neocolonialism, but all under
Right.
American capitalist auspices and the dollar.
Right. And the other factor in the House, dividing the House, which is very central to what I worry about in this election, is the internal division. There's the House abroad, the other houses that are the foreign enemy. Remember, Trump became notorious during the recent weeks in the election by talking about the enemy within. This is the other way that you divide the House, by caste, race in particular. I mean, the working people in the bottom of the House are black, brown, white, and the growing numbers of black and brown. And you could throw the immigrant populations that have snuck into the House as part of that. And then you could say there are women and there are men. There are gender divides in the House. Those are caste. The book, remember, the subtitle of this book is The Struggle Over Class and Caste in America. Class has created this upstairs, downstairs house. Caste has enabled it to survive by dividing, by the ability of people who are on the top floors, the class elites, the capitalist corporate elites, to rule with a good deal of veneer of democracy, because they've been able to ruthlessly divide the population from the very beginning of the country, starting with the division of North and South and capitalism and slavery, by race. And this election that has been so focused on the racial divide, and to some degree the gender divide, both of which have played a very important role in this election. This goes way, way back in the history of the country. The original founding of America was a melding together of a kind of class-based deep state and a caste deep state, which intersected in a troubled way, but in a way that they were able to support each other. And there was a very close interaction between the profitability of caste for a class elite. And what I've been trying to argue in the Trump election, what's clear is that when the Trump agenda, the corporate agenda that he represents, is very unpopular. So how does the elite continue to maintain control over the population? It diverts people from that agenda into an agenda around the culture of race and gender and these other caste divisions that have always been incredibly potent, along with empire and the enemy abroad. The enemy within has always been the ultimate trump card, so to speak. And Trump is playing that card very powerfully, in fact, so effectively that he was able to mobilize 44% of Latino people to vote for him in this election, and a larger number of black males to vote for him, using machismo kind of culture. So these cultural strategies have long been a part of the American capitalist class, which lives on top of the upstairs house, of the upstairs downstairs house, to control and divide people on the bottom. I think Trump has that's always been, Yale is right, that's always been a part of the American system. There's nothing new about that. But Yale's view that we're not going to tread beyond the normal limits of the veneer. Trump is simply going to play this out. There will still be free speech. There will still be environmental regulation. There will still be public education. There will still be. I think he's very wrong about that. I think that this will play out with new forms of. Trump is ready this time. It's very different than the first term. And I think these tools that have always been available, I agree with you, there's nothing new about the tools that are available for this kind of control. I just think Trump is going to take them and make them real. I mean, Cheney may have enacted the Patriot Act and then not able to implement it. All these other things I'm thinking about, they were all able to be implemented. They're now in a position, because they've prepped for 4 years, to actually staff the government and the judiciary and the military with the people who are prepared to go all the way this time. I'm not saying all of this will happen, but if only 10% of it happens, it will be very significant.
Right.
From the very beginning, Southern planters told white trash, we share whiteness.
Right.
Yeah, froze here.
Yeah, froze. Oh, goodness.
Yeah, I'll make a note of this so we can try to edit this for a moment, but he might need to.
Yale, if you can hear us, can he get back on? Yeah.
It's got a black screen. Um, well, I think that he will likely probably some internet issue, so he may log back on. I'm going to remove
Okay,
him
I
for a
hope
moment.
so. Yeah.
So let me change the subject here a little bit, and then we'll get back. He can come back and say what he thinks about Trump's the sort of veneer maybe holding a little more. But I want to
Right.
get into another aspect of the deep state rather than the sort of the sort of cultural foundations of it, the establishment of white supremacy and the continuation of patriarchy, which we see in all civilizations, but in different forms. Um, but the deep state, what makes the deep state, and different from like the normal state or the government, the Weberian state, as we would think of it in social science, um, is that it is a top-down. Here we go. Uh, Hello, we're back here.
Oh, good.
You're back here. So, yeah, I'll just let you finish up what you were saying about the Trump, about how you think that Trump will be not necessarily as likely to completely overhaul the vestiges of democracy or that
I'm
exists,
not
such
saying
as
he
they
won't
do.
do it. I'm not saying he won't do it. I'm saying it's part of a very long process.
Yeah,
And I'm not sure how real the vestiges ever were. Where I keep hearing threats about democracy, and I keep reacting, what democracy?
yeah,
The American people have been fed this belief for a very, very long time. And again, fascism is something the elite turns to when it decides democracy can no longer be
yes,
afforded.
right.
When they're, yes.
Let me expand on this because this is really an aspect of the deep state, and I was trying to explain it before, but we'll probably cut that part out and we'll just resume where you jump back in. So let me put this out there because it's really I did spend 10 years researching the deep state and looking at the literature such as it is on it. We're talking about top-down rule in a nominal democracy, and that has been what the U.S. has been from the beginning. So in some sense, you can say there's always been a deep state in that sense. It's always been a top-down oligarchic regime with a democratic appearance that is mostly veneer, but actually does provide some kind of substance and some sort of theater in which democratic struggles can unfold and sometimes succeed, or at least appear to succeed, in ways that are good for the people and have been good for the oligarchs as well, the people at the top. But in my opinion, it's really in the basis of of civilization in general to be top down and oligarchic. But even in the liberal West, if you go back and you look at John Locke, who is really the guy who most informs the founding fathers, I would say, in
Mhm.
terms of their
I
thinking,
agree.
that he says if there's ever an emergency, the sovereign authority, the executive, can't really be bound by laws if it wouldn't be good for the state. It's like he can't just let the state be destroyed because of an emergency. So he would need to sort of act, decisively, if the law, even if the laws don't allow for him to do what needed to be done. He more or less makes this argument, but he doesn't. It calls these prerogative powers and so on, right? And he doesn't really hash this out, but the essence of it is basically like even under liberal republicanism, whatever, you still are going to have this top-down authority to come in and when things need to be done. Now, in the U.S., you had what Peter Dale Scott would call a deep political system, meaning that you always had the established authorities and laws, but when it came down to it, the powerful could override those. And this could be accomplished in different ways at different points in American history, but the Southern slave power, as it was called, who knows what sort of chicanery they were up to. The theft of Texas, more or less, was a Southern slave oligarch conspiracy. You'd have to say the Mexican American War is another crazy episode. But you also had, and the death of Zachary Taylor, for example, was probably related to some kind of Southern deep state thing. I think that's pretty obvious. It's just the U.S. can't admit it for various mythological reasons. But you've always had, and you had mafias. So insidious organized crime networks and so on, political machines. And if you really upset the oligarchs, there was always a way for them to even be able to kill you. I mean, there was always a kind of secret fascism or proto-fascism before fascism was even a word in terms of the way the regime actually functioned in the United States. Now, what I argue is that with the creation of the national security state and the decision, which was made by Wall Street oligarchs, Council on Foreign Relations, which is Wall Street, they all planned the U.S. post-war empire. And they also needed to create institutions of deep political power, basically executive political power. So they create the covert operations arm of the CIA. This was advocated for by Wall Street guys, and it acts as Wall Street's servant. There's secret police around the world, and you already had things in the FBI that existed before World War II, like the Palmer raids and all the stuff J. Edgar Hoover was doing to harass Marcus Garvey and everybody else. So you already had these institutions in the U.S., but with the Cold War, they have like a permanent emergency, and so they basically can do what Locke says, which is to just act, decisively, and they create all these institutions, and the same sort of figures like mafias are always working with the CIA, the same people who were the kind of dark matter holding up the universe, and the order and the hierarchy before World War II were used by the CIA, because the CIA is not so different from an organized crime syndicate, really. It's just they have state sanction to go around the world and act as, conspiratorial gangsters for capitalism, right? So this issue is also, I think, very key here. And but what is happening with this project, because we created this behemoth and we use foreign intelligence services and foreign organized crime networks, we don't even really know what kind of things they're up to. But they've resorted more, I think, in recent years to clandestine criminality, because I think the Western civilization, after centuries, these projects are kind of breaking down, and so it's getting more ridiculous. You have like the weapons of mass destruction, not like obvious lies for an illegal war. You have Arab Spring Wars, which now look very fishy. You have the Nord Stream bombing. You have the Epstein case. You have the Skripal poisoning in Britain. Russiagate is this hoax, if I didn't say that already. I mean, you have more and more things that's like you even forget about them. You forget about one thing or the other that never really got adjudicated. It used to be that those weird events like the Kennedy assassination were sort of few and far between when they surfaced. But we actually have more and more of these sort of deep events coming up all the time. And they are always in the service of oligarchy and empire when you look at it. Even when you look at Watergate, Nixon's enemies were worse than Nixon. That's why America moved to the right after Nixon with Reagan, I would argue. But what I think is key about this moment is we have run the world this way, and Western civilization has really always been this oligarchy. We've had the Enlightenment and democracy on the one hand, but it's really always been a vicious oligarchy of wealth. But we've finally generated the opposition around the world, and I think that's why they're doing more and more brazen things like the Gaza genocide, this doomed Ukraine war, and now they're thinking like, well, maybe Taiwan would somehow enable us to pull a rabbit out of our hat here. So is the situation of the U.S. and the fact that this deep state, with all of its lawlessness and terrible results for the world and for the rest of humanity, it's in such bad straits. How is this going to impact Trump's ability to maneuver in the world? Just the fact of like, what do you really want to do? Get rid of the U.S. empire and destroy all American legitimacy by becoming a more fascistic, kind of racialized regime at home? I mean, that's where I do think that Trump is more limited by different things, and it also makes it scary because he's kind of unpredictable. But this seems to be where politics is playing out, on the end of centuries of Western imperialism, which seem to be coming to an end.
I don't want to sound like I'm defending Trump, but what I find amazing is that his enemies, and this includes liberals as well as people I consider substantially to his right, like the Cheneys, attack him for not trusting the CIA, the FBI, and the military.
Yeah.
That's his crime. He is
Liberals say that too. That's liberals and Dick Cheney.
They sure do, don't they?
But to get to Aaron's point, Yale, I'm wondering, I don't know how you're feeling about this, and it's sort of a slightly different way of, although very closely related to what we're discussing in our book. And I have a feeling that Trump's policy of sort of policing the world in the service of the American oligarchy. With Elon Musk standing right next to him, looking at how his interests are going to be affected as Trump governs. It's going to be, Aaron, you're describing a kind of systemic unraveling as the American economic decline and the other kind of autocratic regimes and global South regimes, which are moving away from the United States, weaken. I think our book does discuss that dynamic and sees that same sort of pattern. And trying to anticipate, I think that the way that you raise an interesting question. We wrote this book before Trump came into power. And when you raised the question of when Trump comes into power, will he try to really, given his quote anti-war kind of rhetoric and the fact that branding that he's offered, but as a certain thing, he's going to erode NATO. He probably is going to force a reasonable territorial compromise where Ukraine will have to cede Crimea and the Donetsk, the eastern Ukrainian provinces, which are already Russian-speaking and Russian-friendly to Russia. It's a reasonable compromise in many ways. It should have been done long before the dire destruction that was carried out by this war in Ukraine. It could have been stopped much earlier with a much more reasonable compromise.
He was asking for all those things before the invasion.
Yeah, but in terms of
to be resolved.
Right, but in terms of the larger picture that Aaron is talking about, is it going to lead to a collapse of Western American hegemonic plan? I think Trump is going to create some contradictions there. He's going to create a much more unpredictable, selective, very personally directed. This is sort of the more, strongman notion of how the country, the empire is going to be more selectively managed. It may be managed in the sort of the Pacific theater, for example, in ways that Trump sees as particularly important to his own interests and the agenda, and not managed well in Eastern Europe or in the Caucasus. There may be, in other words, the unraveling, Aaron, that you're describing, which I think our book largely affirms, that American global, deep state interests have been weakened and are undergoing further decline, is going to take a very selective form. It will take place in certain parts of the world and not in others. You said racially, America will retreat into this kind of another autocratic racial things, and he's not going to permit that going to happen. I think that's the question right now. I think Trump is. Yeah, I just finished my sentence. No, I'll let you. My view is that, we don't know how far the country will go toward the kind of. I think Trump would be very satisfied with a racist, fascist kind of model at home that rewards him and his cronies and concedes a good deal of the empire to other, prior to World War I. And I think the world might return back to that kind of more pluralistic kind of oligarchy rather than one. And Trump might be the one who presides over the deterioration of American global hegemony toward this more pluralistic kind of imperial model that characterized the world prior to World War I.
The American empire has been in long decline. As I say, it's gone from 50% of world GDP to 20%. It is still the world's overwhelming military hegemon. That's not questioned. But it is no longer the economic hegemon it once was. Britain went through a very similar process. And ultimately, it conceded power to the United States, which basically inherited the British Empire. Interestingly enough, when Britain surrendered world domination, it instituted natural health care, other social services, public transportation. It actually improved the quality of civilian life as it gave up world domination to the United States, with whom
the U.S. sort of took it in a sense. They were not passive about it. They wanted to destroy the pound sterling area.
Anything but. And they agreed to act as America's junior partner.
Little thug buddy.
Yes. Now, Germany went through a far more severe crisis. It was a sudden collapse, not a gradual erosion. Is the United States losing power? No question. Is it in a crisis on the order of Germany in the 1930s? Absolutely not. I would argue the United States was in a more severe crisis in the early 1970s, late 1960s, is today. So you don't need fascism. Germany, the German elite had to either strengthen democratic veneer, possibly even move to some kind of socialism, or allow the Nazis to come in. Given a choice between communism and fascism, the capital elite is certainly going to fascism. The United States is not in that situation right now. I'm not saying it won't happen. And actually, Trump is deliberately creating crises that don't exist. We keep hearing the border crisis. There was no border crisis before. Trump invented it. But people buy it to the point that even Biden and Harris have to pretend it's real and have to agree to toughen up on the border. But it was something that the United States was doing fine with. It was not a problem. They provided sources of cheap labor. They did have jobs that the American citizenry was not willing to do. It was beneficial, but Trump labeled it a crisis, and now it is seen as such. And even the so-called liberals have to treat it as a crisis. But
I'll point out a couple of differences between the British example and now. In the British case, they could essentially hand over the policing and protection of their internationally invested capital to the United States.
yes,
And so that was pretty much what all the countries did that used to be great empires, were they got folded into this dollar system, and the U.S. would kind of look out for their interests and for basically the interests of invested capital anywhere. And so that's why the French have continued to be prosperous, in part by exploiting their area, the West Africa, the way that they have, which is now seems to be coming to an end. And the British had their investments around the world. And so but the U.S. does not look to be able to hand it off to another white hegemon that's going to do for the U.S. what the U.S. did for Britain back then. And the other aspect of it is that while there was a crisis at the end of the Bretton Woods system, the U.S. had, and it seemed more acute because of the democratic uprisings in the streets, the U.S. actually had a strong material foundation to be able to stage one of the great coups in human history, which was rolling the old Bretton Woods system, which had some restraints in the form of the gold peg, and establishing this new petrodollar system, which they did essentially by telling Saudi Arabia and others, take our dollars and only our dollars for oil, and buy treasury bonds and secret auctions, or we might kill you. That's how Michael Hudson describes it, and I think that's probably about right.
Yeah.
And additionally, in that time period, they took all of those petrodollars and they loaned them out to to third world countries. And then when the Volcker shock came, they got into terrible debt, and the IMF and emerged to allow the West to capitalize on all these debt crises. And the U.S. was actually stronger than ever under Reagan, so strong that they could basically affect the end of the Soviet Union and be the unipolar power. The difference now is that I don't see that the U.S. has this underlying power. We don't have client regimes in all the oil-rich states in the world anymore. Quite the opposite. Venezuela, Iran, and Russia are our big enemies. We don't have there's a secret gold mine in Indonesia that the U.S. basically was able to steal by murdering probably a million or more Indonesians in 1965. Americans don't even know about that. But that, when the gold price exploded, what did that do to the fortunes of the oligarchs who made off with that fortune, which we're still actually getting? The Freeport McMoran mine in West Papua, it's the biggest gold mine in human history, and we stole it basically. But we don't have, at this point, I believe, the material resources to come up with some sort of new gambit like we did there with the petrodollar, whatever we want to call it. So this, I think, is the most profound crisis, not just of the U.S., but of Western imperialism, because the non-white world, the non-Western world has never been so strong and organized and basically unified against, their enemy and the enemy of the global majority, which is this regime that we live under.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting perspective that you're taking, Aaron. I'm not sure that it will take, it may well be, like I said, that the kind of pluralistic oligarchy and imperial slicing of the cake might, along with bringing in more autocratic regimes like China and Russia and so forth, maybe find ways to sort of manage the world relatively. But I think your basic argument is correct, that there is a kind of, and I think both of us agree, there's a kind of sustained global decline in the American empire and the world, the ability of any one country in the world to manage it. And what that suggests to me, and here Yale and I might come again back into more agreement, is that the crisis will deepen. And it will deepen not only because of the loss of the global South and the ability to sort of make up for all the sort of extraction of wealth and power that came from that regime, but again, the internal, what you called, Aaron, I think you're sort of calling social or cultural or other kinds of internal dynamics that are associated with demographic shifts inside the United States, the growth of and the sort of, I think Trump in a way is going to intensify this, because I don't think he really cares about the larger systemic crisis that we're talking about. He wants to simply ensure that the parts of the regime, the global regime, that suit his economic, corporate, business, and allied interests will be sustained. If much of that falls off to other powers, whether it's Russia or other countries, I think Trump is fine with that. But the crisis itself will be felt at home deeply. And when you combine that with the racial and demographic shifts that are going on, that leads to me toward a real fascist turn. When the crisis gets deeper, and I think you've added an element to our story, Aaron, that is helpful in the way I'm thinking about this. It intensifies, as Yale's been saying, fascism emerges when the system reaches a kind of crisis that the oligarchy feels it cannot manage with the veneer and the freedoms that, as I've said all along, have remained important, even though they fundamentally misled people about the nature of democracy and oligarchic rule in the West. But as that crisis intensifies, I think we're all agreeing that that veneer is going to be shredded more and more and more. Even when you've been saying that the crisis is simply not. Yeah. So if this analysis is correct, and if I'm correct about Trump's dispositions on this, which I think are genuinely to let go of some of these elements of the global imperium, which he feels are not directly in his interests and which he doesn't care about, it's going to intensify the crisis globally, which will have global effects as well as American effects, and I think increase the likelihood of authoritarian and neo-fascist forces that can rise in periods of crisis. And again, I think for people who don't know the background of this kind of complicated story we're trying to tell here, is that we do show in the book that neo-fascist forces have been a breeding ground in America since the beginning of the country. These class dynamics around capitalism and the concentration of big fortunes that erode the country and empower the deep state and help guide it. That's always been it's always been associated with a caste-based kind of erosion of democracy. So we've had, fascism is a form of caste-based control, which normally perpetuates the power of a corporate oligarchy in crisis. And I think that's what we're going to see under Trump. We're going to see a caste-based kind of fascism, authoritarianism emerge, which will continue to solidify relative oligarchic control, both inside the United States and in large sectors of the world, but not all of the world, as the American global power continues to recede. But in terms of what that means inside this country, it's why I feel very depressed today, is because I think that inside this country, the effects are going to be very powerful. And really what we haven't talked about is what do ordinary people do to combat this kind of, if it's true, I mean, it used to be, we felt when it's true, within the veneer, we could organize resistance. We could go out in the street. Women, in 2017, January 20th, they organized the biggest women's march in history against Trump. There was a revival of labor organization, in recent years and so forth. The question is now, as the veneer is, let's say, whether Yale thinks slowly or more, I think more rapidly, as it is shredded, what kind of resistance is possible? And the interesting thing here is that I think part of this is that it is going to depend on some kinds of global solidarity. It means some sort of tying to elements of the global South and movements in the global South that I'm talking about in Latin America and in Africa and in East Asia, which may be important because it's going to be very hard to do all of this organizing in a more authoritarian environment at home where the veneer of democracy is being torn asunder.
We have to acknowledge Trump carried the popular vote. We have to acknowledge that there is a very large population that has no problem with Trumpism. That if we expect popular uprisings, social movements to resist and resist to have large support when the deep state, the state, the military, the police, as you say, are moving towards fascism and going to become far more repressive, can we really expect effective popular resistance when in fact much of what's going on is very popular?
Well, that's where I disagree. Even in the United States, about 90% of Americans say they hate big money. They hate the role of Elon Musk in power.
But they voted for Trump.
They voted for Trump, but Trump is going to then inaugurate a set of policies that they're going to feel in their prices. They're going to feel when tariffs go up 20%, there's going to be a 20% tax on everything people buy. They're going to feel it.
They knew about the tariffs as to vote for him. They
didn't know what the tariffs would do to their buying power. They didn't know that. They thought it meant more jobs and more security at home. It's not going to be that way. And so people learn from regimes. Regimes are popular, and then they begin to fade when people begin to say, "Oh, I just lost my job. I just lost my health care. I just lost my ability to go to community college. I lost my vocational thing."
They know he wants to abolish Obamacare. They know he is a victim felon.
No, he's been saying he says something better. Elon Musk has come out. Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, has said the first year or two of the Trump administration is going to be very hard times. He's preparing people because he's preparing to cut Medicare, Social Security. They don't know that. They don't know that. They think it's going to be.
I'm not sure that people totally grasp what that represents. And it seems also that the Democrats really fell off enormously. Trump's gain wasn't so enormous. It's the Democrats could not get anyone to come out for them because how do you say Trump is a felon? Okay, Trump is a criminal. Trump is a criminal. He's been convicted of this. He's been convicted of that. When you're literally guilty of of genocide, the worst crime human beings have ever committed, and you should be in jail for the rest of your life, but you're out there talking about joy? The Democrats are absurd.
The Democrats
it's not that I think Trump is better, but Trump hasn't committed genocide yet. Among his many crimes, suspected or not, genocide is not among them. And the Democrats are just like, no, that's not happening. I think that they're supposed to have the more intellectual base, supposedly. Mm-hmm. But if anybody who votes Democrat who's alert at all and is not brainwashed is like, well, genocide is not my red line. Check the box. It's so sick. And the bigger question to me is not so. Even though the domestic stuff could cause a lot of pain, to me the biggest fear is what is Trump going to do about Iran? Because Israel, I think, is basically checkmated, and that's why Bibi is trying desperately to somehow draw the U.S. into a war with Iran. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe they think that as much as the Democrats and Biden and everyone are dominated by the Israel lobby, that Trump is even more so. And that's why does Sheldon Adelson's widow give him $100 million? Reportedly, in the forward, it was because they thought Trump would sanction the Israeli annexation of the West Bank, but which it would be a horror and a crime, of course. But the bigger issue is, what are they going to do with Iran? Because if Iran, Hezbollah, even Hamas, and the Yemenis, the resistance in Syria and Iraq, I think that the whole project for a new American century and everything we've been trying to do in the Middle East, which is really, I think, the biggest driver, the neocon insanity of the 21st century, is the biggest driver of U.S. decline. Is Trump going to get the U.S. into a potentially nuclear war in order to try to save Israel in the Middle East?
I want to go.
This is the biggest question.
I think that's one of the big foreign policy questions. And I think that we don't know. I think we may have a war with Iran, which Israel will lead. I think that's very possible. I think it's also very possible that Trump will make another decision and say it's not in his interest. It's more. He'll have an alliance with the Saudis, but he won't go to war necessarily with. He'll rein Netanyahu in. We don't know. But I want to go back just if I can, because we're near the end of it. I just want to say the real problem with the Democrats and what people can do now, and Yale and I talk about this a lot in the book, has to do with class politics and identity politics. What's wrong with the Democratic Party is it's abandoned the sort of understanding that corporate elites run the world and run the United States. What have they done? They've introduced a politics around race and gender and identity politics, which is basically essentially played in to the corporate elite's hands of dividing the population by these identity politics. And so, Aaron, when you say, you veered away from this, but I think what people would want to take away from this conversation is, what are these guys talking about? When they're talking about what are we going to do to sort of oppose and challenge, whether it's deeply authoritarian or modestly authoritarian that Trump is having. And in the book, we make a concerted case about what has fundamentally gone wrong with American politics, and particularly the politics of the Democratic Party, since the end of the New Deal. The New Deal was the last period where blue-collar, non-college voters were voting Democratic, and they were voting Democratic by huge margins. Since the 70s, the migration, the biggest earthquake in American politics, has been the migration of non-college white voters away from the Democratic Party massively to the Republican Party, which is exactly what sort of coalesced today in the Trump victory. And it's completely predictable. The Democrats made no effort really to challenge the fundamental economic, corporate system that has basically put the entire working class, with both black and white, black, white, brown, male, female, in a state of crisis. It's real, and the Democratic Party is not viewed as a party of change or a party addressing these real needs. You hear it over and over again, people talking, they couldn't pay their rent, they couldn't pay for their grocery bills, they couldn't pay for a car, whatever it is. And the Democratic Party is not offering ordinary people, like all the people in the downstairs or the upstairs house, any kind of clear solution to the overwhelming problem they're feeling in their lives. And until the Democratic Party offers a class politics, which is truly going to feel in the gut of ordinary people like this, oh yeah, this is going to make a difference of how much money I have in the bank at the end of the week. Am I going to be able to pay this medical bill? Am I going to pay that? We're not going to get a solution to this problem. But there is a progressive sector. If you listen to Bernie Sanders and the squad, Bernie Sanders has been saying what we've been saying about the problem over and over again. Bernie in the last few days has put out a missive of, 10 letters to the Democratic Party saying you're destroying the possibility of any kind of meaningful. You're talking about saving democracy. You're talking about destroying the last remnants of it by essentially abandoning any kind of politics that's going to bring working class people together against this, incredibly vicious criminal corporate elite. And that's the message that people have to hear. It's not implausible. There's a super majority of people out there, for a group of people. It's worth remembering that Michigan, Wisconsin both voted for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 primary over Hillary and over Trump. There's a very large sector of the American working population, particularly the white non-college voter, that are ready to vote for a class politics. But the caste politics.
whether or not
give Yale the last word here.
Okay.
you can debate whether or not a Biden-Harris are guilty of genocide. Trump, when he was already in power, committed genocide at the same level. But there is no question whatsoever that Bush Cheney committed genocide on the order of the worst atrocities in the world. And yet the Democrats treated them as allies. And so from that point of view, Charlie's right. They clearly are essentially maintaining neoliberalism. They clearly are maintaining an extremely aggressive, offensive foreign policy. But the question is, are they losing support for that? Or are these things actually popular? That everything Charlie listed about the abandonment of class politics indeed is true, but does caste, and pun intended, does caste trump class? That if you were given a choice, and it seems over and over again throughout history, of whether or not I get social services or keeping social services away from blacks and other people of color, I would rather give up my own security to make sure they are in worse shape than I am. And that is exactly the kind of thinking Trump appeared to, and it is extremely effective. Caste is, in fact, a way of getting people to abandon worrying about class. It doesn't matter how badly I am doing as long as the other caste is doing worse. As long as my caste is successful and we have a master living in a plantation in Mar-a-Lago, if he does well, since I share with him whiteness, I'm doing well. It doesn't matter if I can't pay my bills. Doesn't matter if I am facing rapid inflation. It doesn't matter if my kids go to school. What matters is those people, those immigrants, those un-Americans are suffering more than I am. And for that, I applaud Trump, and that's why I want to support him.
Yes, and my view is that Yale's right that and this is why fascism is such an attractive politics. It plays off the division, the sort of psychological power of feeling identified with your biologically defined soulmate in caste, whether it's your race or your gender. I agree, those are very, very, and they can overcome a lot of inequality and class difference. But in the end, I think that Yale sort of feels these are the most fundamental parts of human nature, is to feel this identification across, caste, unity, race, or gender. And my view is that these fundamental economic kinds of interests that people across different races and genders share, my reading of the current public opinion and history suggests that's an equally, if not more powerful force. And that if people do indeed suffer a very rapid, I think the world economy is going to go through massive crises very quickly under Trump, maybe not in the first year, but quickly. I think we'll see a significant resistance, if resistance is possible at that point, in the challenge to the new Trump regime. But thank you very much, Aaron, for giving us the space to end. I really appreciate, I want to say, your own thinking about these issues, because it's added to my own understanding of how this whole story plays out. It's very helpful.
Well, thank you both for talking about your book. And could you tell us where the best place is to get the book?
Yeah, you can go online. There's some place, it's readily available at Amazon. It's at some bookstores. You can get it on sale for certain places. So I'd look around online, but the book is called Who Owns Democracy? And I think for people struggling with their emotions at this point in history, it will be helpful to sort of read the history of how people have dealt with this kind of crisis in the past.
Well, Charles Derber and Yale Magrass, thank you both very much for
Thank
talking with
you.
us today. And let's hope that somehow some kind of democratic state will emerge that will
We can hope.
eventually supersede
Right,
the deep state, because we're in a bad way right now. So
right.
thank you both very
Aaron,
much.
thank you so much. I'm real late to class, so I'm going to run off.
All right,
So,
very good.
okay,
All right.
take care. Bye bye.
Goodbye, gentlemen. As I said in the intro, we made this episode available to everyone to help promote Who Owns Democracy? The Real Deep State and the Struggle Over Class and Caste in America by Charles Derber and Yale Magrass. Please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for the best coverage and analysis of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. Our new series on the Lansky Syndicate, CIA, Mossad threads running through the JFK assassination, Watergate, and beyond has begun, and we're really excited about it. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. It is also in the show notes. If you can afford it, please subscribe. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. This interview was scheduled after a publicist for either Rutledge or Seven Stories Press reached out to me since I've interviewed some of her other authors, including Peter Phillips most recently. Charles and Yale were not aware that I had published a political science dissertation on the deep state, so that added a kind of funny element to this discussion. On the one hand, their views on the American deep state differ from mine in that they don't focus so much on the lawlessness of the regime and the state crimes against democracy or deep events which the regime can deploy when its objectives cannot be met lawfully. But the authors do admit that the elites in the national security state are able to override laws, and they are at least agnostic about things like the JFK assassination. On the whole, I would say it is at least encouraging that some figures within the old guard institutional left are addressing the important and suppressed reality that ours is not a lawful democracy, but is instead a disguised system of top-down governance for the purpose of maintaining hegemony over global capitalism. I don't know how much power the American people actually have as this thing implodes. At the very least, we need more people to understand that we are not playing a game of lawful democratic politics. Instead, we are stuck, whether we want to be or not, on the devil's chessboard.